BPMA for having me here today. It's an absolute honour to be involved in such a fantastic and prestigious event. As Latham said, my name's Michael Byrne, and I'm the founder of an organisation called Lived Experience Trauma Support, and the acronym for that is LETS. And what we do is help businesses and local authorities all around the UK start the conversation about mental health in the workplace. And we do that through our training and support services. But what we really do it from is from our lived experience. Prior to setting up my own business, I have 33 years experience within local government and within housing associations in Scotland. But what I also have is lived experience of mental health within the workplace. So I'll get a little bit about me. My name is Michael Byrne. I'm 51 years old. I'm married. So I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I'm a brother, and I'm an uncle, and I'm all of those things. But I also have a mental illness. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that diagnosis has came about after a lifetime of traumatic events, some of which I'm going to speak about today. So in light of that, I'd like to just give you a trigger warning. I'm going to speak about real life events, and some of those events will likely to resonate with the viewers and watchers and those present today. And if it does, what I always say is grab a cup of tea, cup of coffee, glass of water, still tune in, come back, because the happy ending is standing right in front of you. So without further ado, I'll condense some of my life into the next 30 to 45 minutes for you. So I was born in Glasgow, in a suburb of Glasgow called the Gorbals. Some people may know it has a really bad reputation way back in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And I was born in 1969 in a house in Glasgow in Gorbals. And back then it was perfectly normal to be born in the house, but the early narrative of my life was that as soon as I was born, the light bulbs exploded. That my parents were looking for 666 on my head, that I was a devil's child. Both my parents told me that neither of them wanted me and neither of them loved me, just depending who was trying to hurt me that day. I was psychologically, physically and emotionally abused at a very early age. And indeed, my earliest memories are of a 3-year-old boy terrified in bed because my mother and father were physically fighting with each other, and being afraid that I was going to be kidnapped as such by either party as they fell out with each other and argued, and taken from the house in protest. So that early narrative really built the foundation of what was to happen to me psychologically for the rest of my life. When I was 5, I started school, and I knew from a very early age that I was not the smartest child in school, far from it. But what I did realise was that I was safer in school than I was at home. And again, that's something that I began to realise at a later stage was a fallback position for me. I went to secondary school when I was 12 and left secondary school in 1985 with 4 O grades, or the equivalent, whatever they may be, throughout the rest of the UK. And I started as a YTS for Glasgow City Council in 1986, with £27 a week and a travel card to commute all the way around Glasgow. And for the first time I had freedom. And I had some money in my pocket. And I felt a bit like Rockefeller. And so one evening, when I was 16 years old, I came home and seen my father was strangling my mother. I quickly interjected and threw the one and only punch I've ever thrown in my life, and was quickly evicted from the household, as they like to say in Big Brother. The irony not lost on me that I throw one punch after 13, 14 years of physical abuse by both my parents, and I am the one that has to leave the household. So for a month or so, I sofa surfed. But the one thing that I did was I fell back to that 5-year-old boy. While I was going through that period of homelessness, I turned up for work every single day. Now, this is something I'd like to ask all of you to do as we go forward here. 2 questions I'd like to ask yourself. As I go through these events of my life, ask yourself, what would have you done if I had been your staff member, if I'd have been your colleague, if you'd been my director, if you'd been my chief executive? What would you have done as I embark upon this journey and tell you what happened? But the second question I'd like to ask you to think of is, what will you do in the future? Because things aren't the same anymore. So as we emerge out of this period of lockdown, ask yourself as I go through this with you, what will you do if you have a staff member like me? So back to being the 16-year-old boy again, returning up for work every day, homeless, and eventually got let back into the household. And my relationship with my father was still very poor, very, very poor. And we stayed in a 2 or 3 bedroom house, I can't recall the size of it, but we would avoid each other. And when I was 20 years old, I got into a relationship and left the household as quickly as I could. In 1994, I got married, and on my wedding day, my mother and father got a hold of me and confirmed to me that they were getting a divorce, which is just an incredible wedding gift to give anyone, particularly a son. But what that meant was that my relationship with my father ironically got better. By this point, I was working for Glasgow City Housing, and my father needed accommodation because he was homeless. And in no way did I influence the fact that he got a 1-bedroom apartment in the Gorbals in Glasgow. But over the course of the next 2 years, my relationship got better. However, on Byrne's Night 1996, which is the 25th of January, I came home after being at a Byrne's function for my wife to tell me that the police were looking for me, which, believe me, is never a good thing in Glasgow. And my wife explained to me that my father had been murdered that evening, which was an incredible body blow, as you can imagine. I went down to the Gorbals police station. I couldn't make sense out of them. They couldn't make sense out of me. It was just the effects of the trauma. And then I went home. And on a Friday morning, the morning after it, I put my suit, my shirt, my tie on, and I went into work. Unexplainedly, but actually in retrospect, what I was really doing was emulating that 5-year-old boy. So I went into work the next morning, and bless my manager at that time, was the one and only manager who ever actually stopped and asked me, "What are you doing here?" And I explained to him that I really didn't know where I had to be, but could I get the afternoon off to go and identify my father's body from the Glasgow City mortuary, which he gave me. Over the course of the next couple of days, I was interviewed by the police as a suspect in my father's murder, and then a murder hunt ensued. And after about a month or so, they caught the chap. And I remember getting a telephone call simply asking me about a roll end of carpet, ironically. And I confirmed that that roll end of carpet came from my house, and the police informed me that they'd got the chap. What that allowed me to do was to bury my father, and then subsequently there was a court case of which the chap got found guilty of culpable homicide and was sentenced to 15 years. And that wee bit of my life has maybe taken about 5 or 6 minutes to tell you, but what I do know is I turned up for work every single day. I never sought help, and I never asked for help. I was too embarrassed. I feared the judgment of my peers, my manager, colleagues, and so on, and I didn't want to ask for help. I was 25, perhaps 26 around about that time, and I believed that no one could fix me, no one could understand. The organisation, the council that I worked for, didn't really have anything in place to support me, but equally, I find it very difficult to ask for help. I kept it all in. But I also know that I was probably incapable of working on many of those days, and I was probably an unreliable employee, certainly not worthwhile probably having there on most days. Who would be after the mother of the father? But I attended every single day. So very quickly after that, because I wouldn't speak and I wouldn't open up to anyone, my marriage very quickly deteriorated, and within a short space of time, my marriage ended. And with that, I moved out of the family house and moved into some furnished accommodation on the south side of London. And with that loneliness and isolation, to combat all of that, I turned to alcohol. And on the weekend, would pretty much go missing from a Friday evening until a Sunday evening, but turn up for work on a Monday. But by this point, I began to realise that if I turned up for work with a suit, shirt, tie, smile, clean shaven and a haircut, people just seen that. They didn't look very much further than what was seen in front of them. So my struggles were invisible at that point in time. After about 2 years or so, I got into a relationship and started to turn my life around. And after about 2 years of that relationship, my fiancée at the time informed me that we were expecting twins, which was just fantastic. Absolutely beautiful. My father had been a twin, so it felt very serendipitous. However, after about 3 months of that, I got a phone call one Sunday morning after being out with friends. and the girl informed me that she had miscarried both of the twins. It's devastating, and for those who've experienced it will know exactly those sentiments. I went to her house, a flat, and we had a chat, a conversation, and again, back to that, we couldn't understand each other. The trauma was just too much for us and we couldn't communicate. It was a Sunday, and on the Monday, I put my suit, my shirt and tie on, and I went to work. And I wouldn't speak about it. I didn't speak about it. I just simply couldn't find it in me to open up. And as a result of that, again, I kept it all in. And what actually happened was that my relationship with my fiance at the time ended at that moment in time. And the future that I had was no longer there. And that made things very difficult because now I had the pain of that. The irony around about that time was not lost on me, in that the worse my private life was, the better my career was. Because I was turning up for work and I was working 12 to 14 hours a day and absolutely ignoring my private life and not dealing with it. But no one was asking what was going on in my life. People knew that we were expecting twins and no one asked. They heard about it, but no one asked. And again, I converted back to type and couldn't ask for help. So for the next 6 or 7 years, I absolutely went about sabotaging my private life in an attempt to not feel the pain that I was in. And I did it very well. Anytime I got into any sort of relationship, I sabotaged it and ended it for fear of the relationship escalating to something that I couldn't handle. And through all of that, I worked every day. I was turning up for work when I was incapable of delivering an appropriate service, but I was also not seeking the help that I badly needed. In 2010, after about 7 years of behaving like this and my career taking off, and by this point becoming a director for a housing organisation, I got into a relationship again with a girl who was subsequently to become my wife. And I decided that I would turn my life around and make a go of this. And in 2011, proposed, and in 2012 we got married, and it's a fantastic occasion. However, what actually happened to me then was that I became a danger again. Because in the workplace I could pretend to be this person, happy, smiley, and a facade of everything. And when I was at home, just on my own, I could be me. And when I was in the relationship, I could be that person. But then I got married and the two worlds collided. My wife moved in with me and I had nowhere to be me. I continually had to be the director and I continually had to be the husband. At no point could it be me because I was fearful of the judgment. In my career, the potential career suicide of opening up. And in my private life, I've been seen as a failure. So after about a year of that, my wife, I think, had had enough. And in mid-November, around the 9th of November, my wife explained to me that she'd really like to move home in Glasgow to be closer to her mother-in-law. We went to see a new property and we put a deposit down on it. And it was great. And it was on the 9th of November. 9 is a big number for me. I'm born in September, the 15th, ironically, which is today. But you add the 1 and 5 together, it's 6. You turn the 6 upside down and it's a 9. That's the extremes I'll go to get a 9 in my life. However, on the 29th of November 2013, I was standing in a bar in Glasgow called the Clutha Vaults when a helicopter landed on top of us and killed 10 people. Nothing prepares you for that. Child abuse, murder of my father, loss of twins, absolutely nothing can prepare you for that devastation that happened that evening. Almost immediately after it happened, I got people out, and I'm happy with what I did and the fact that I rescued people and assisted people out into a safe environment. But almost immediately my mind began to play tricks on me. Over the course of the next couple of days, I was questioned by police. And the first thing that the chap said to me, the officer said to me was, "You look like a big boy. You'll be able to tell us exactly what happened." And I knew yet again that I was being judged just simply on how I looked. Because I looked okay, they thought I was okay. But inside I was broke. I was absolutely broke. And by the Sunday, I had convinced myself that I believed that I was meant to be there to help the people that I helped, and that I was never going to speak about this again. I was never going to seek help. I was never going to show vulnerability, and that I would be okay. I could get through it. And on a Monday morning, yep, you've guessed it, suit, shirt, tie on, and drove to work. As I said, I was a director for a housing organisation, and I firmly believed that I had to lead by example. I couldn't show weakness. I can turn up for work despite being in this disaster. But the reality was somewhat different. Incredibly, my chief executive at that point in time, who worked just a couple of offices down from me in the corridor, never came and asked me how I was, never offered any support. But the staff who came in that day would come in and ask, was I okay? I knew I wasn't okay. And every time I got asked that question from them, I felt tearful. I felt that I was going to burst into tears. And that was the last thing that I really wanted my staff to see of me. I wanted to keep this image going. But the reality was that I was broke. So I ended up closing my door to my office and just thought I'll get through today, then I'll get through the week. But the reality was that I was extremely suicidal. However, over the course of the next couple of months, I had the house move to deal with, and that took me into 2014. Later on in 2014, I went to the Priory in the south side of Glasgow, which is a psychological centre, really, who assess mental health well-being, and they diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. However, during the assessment, I would only admit to being in a clutha, not all of the other things that I'd been through, because I felt that that was okay to admit that. And the first thing I said was, I don't want you to tell my boss. I don't want you to tell my wife. In fact, I don't want you to tell anyone. Give me that report. And I kept it for 4 years. I didn't want to tell anyone. I was too ashamed. And then just shortly after that, I had called to go to my GP. My wife had kept saying to me, every time I look at you, there's something in your throat that doesn't look right. And incredibly, I went to the GP, and he instantly said to me that he thought I had a tumour in my throat, which was extremely rare in men. So he made a swift appointment for me to go to Glasgow Royal Infirmary for a biopsy. I went, got a biopsy, which came back inconclusive, and they scheduled me for emergency surgery because they believed at this point that potentially it was cancer. Now, even then, I informed my wife that it wasn't cancer, I would be okay. I briefly mentioned it to my chief executive that I was going for an operation, it may be cancer in my throat, but I'll be back very, very quickly. And that was the end of the conversation. I went in for surgery early December, and I woke up in the most excruciating pain I'd ever been in. And shortly afterwards, I was happier than I'd ever been. And that's the wonder of morphine, the wonder of drugs, as I was later to find out. But what I also knew was that if I got up and about, they would let me out really quickly. They would think that I was okay because I knew that by acting the part, people believed it. And sure enough, 6 p.m, the consultant came round. First of all, he told me that they'd taken a tumour the size of an ounce from my throat and also half my thyroid. And they were going to send it away for cancer tests. That bit of it really didn't interest me too much. All I wanted to know was, could I leave? Could I get out? And incredibly, he did. I was able to fool him as well. And I went home, and 10 days later, I was back at work. Incapable of working. I simply filled in a return to work form and passed it to my chief executive, and that was the end of it. A couple of days later, prior to Christmas, I got the all clear. But they didn't know where it came from, and I had to go back for 3 monthly checks for the next year. Into 2015, I came home one evening from an annual general meeting, went upstairs for a shower, and blacked out. Woke up in a pool of blood. I'd inadvertently hit my head on something in the bathroom and was taken to Glasgow Royal Infirmary urgently. They stitched me back together and sent me home. They didn't do any tests or any checks. And I was quite happy with that because I didn't want them to do that. And I went back to work next morning for a meeting with the chief executive and directors. And again, no one asked, was I okay? And again, I wasn't offering anything either. Later in 2015, my wife had a conversation with me saying that she'd like to start a family, of which I said I didn't want to do. because all I could think about was the past and the trauma that I'd been through. However, I realised how incredibly selfish that was, and I did what everyone does when they don't know the answer to a question. I put it into Google. And I Googled, is it okay for a man to be scared to be a father? And all these wonderful responses come up from beautiful women all over the world saying it's perfectly normal. So that evening I went home and said to my wife, okay, let's go for it. Metaphorically, not actually going for it. And within that first month, my wife fell pregnant. And 9 months later, my son was born. And such a beautiful occasion, and it's the highlight of my life. But with that came real fear. As I'd been abused as a child, my biggest fear was that I was going to perpetrate some form of abuse on my child. And I was too scared to do that. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want my trauma to be passed to my son. So my routine would be I would wake my son at 7 a.m. and I would go into work for 7:30. And I would return home at 8 p.m. and totally avoid contact with my son. He'd already be sleeping. And periodically through the night, I'd get up and so on for him. But I avoided all contact, and I did that for 8 months because I believed that the less contact, the safer it was for him. But again, I was turning up for work every day. And again, no one was interested in joining those dots together and saying, this chap's had a son, but he's in here, he's in this office more than ever. Why is that? Is something wrong? Is something going on? A simple question to ask, perhaps. And then on the 1st of April 2017, my mental health breakdown began in full swing. And yes, it was on April Fool's Day of all days. And an Asda car park of all places in Glasgow. And I was sitting at a pedestrian crossing, watching this child and his father cross the pedestrian crossing, and a car hit me side on. I never seen it coming. And almost immediately I began to feel unwell. I got out of the car, went and checked on the elderly gentleman who was driving it, and he was fine, everything was okay, we swapped details, and I went in and got my shopping. But almost immediately I began to feel unwell. It was a Saturday, and over the course of the next couple of days, I further deteriorated. But however, on a Monday, I went into work, obviously with my suit, shirt and tie on and my facade. However, by the Thursday, I was now incapable of getting up out of my seat without falling over. I grudgingly went to my GP, and he informed me that he believed that I was having a stroke. And again, got me back up to Glasgow Royal Infirmary. The only thing I could think of was that I was too scared to tell my boss that I was now in hospital. So I asked one of my housing managers to inform the chief executive that I was in hospital. I was too scared to do it. My concern was that if I told my chief executive, it would be career suicide for me. I wanted to aspire to that level. I was a director and I wanted to be a chief executive. But I believed that if I told them I was struggling with my mental health, that would be the end of it for me. The culture within that workplace, particularly for a man, was very toxic in my view, and was not conducive in any way to a man opening up saying I'm struggling. So over the course of the remainder of that day, I protested vehemently to all the hospital staff that there was nothing wrong with me. I was simply falling over because I had vertigo, which simply isn't the case. And they kept me in that evening, and then the following day, after much pleading and begging from me, they let me out. But they let me out under false pretenses to them. You see, I kept saying to them, you need to let me out because I have to get to my work. Oh, and by the way, I've got an 8-month-old son as well. My priorities were so wrong. But my main priority was if I go to work, the world will think I'm okay and I can continue on with this suit of armour and facade. And I did. I got let out on the Friday afternoon. On a Monday, I went to work. Now, when I was discharged, they told me to take blood thinning tablets, gave me all sorts of things, not to drive, not to go to work and so on. And I broke all of those rules and I went to work. The following week, I got an MRI, and again, it came back inconclusive. But what was conclusive was that my mental health breakdown was now beginning. In my head, what was actually happening was that the flashbacks from the car crash was taking me to the flashbacks of the helicopter landing on top of the Clutha Bar. That flashback was then taking me to all the bodies and so on that I witnessed that evening, which then took me to having to go to Glasgow City Mortuary and identify my father's body. My father was murdered when he was 48, and I was just about to turn 48. An absolute imperfect, perfect storm. So I knew that I was breaking down, but I couldn't ask for help. The working environment I was in was not conducive to asking for help. There was no one other than the chief executive, I believe, that I could go to. There was no mental health first aiders. There was no policies or strategies in place that I was comfortable enough with that I could go and get support. What actually then happened was that I reverted back to time, and I began to self-sabotage both my professional career and my private life. And I made a really good job of it. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but I made a really good job of it. And instead of being a diligent professional who met every deadline and was a fantastic performer, I then became someone who deliberately missed deadlines, didn't perform very well, and began verbally abusing staff. And when I did those things, I self-reported myself to the chief executive, but still nothing happened. All of these things were a cry for help. I just wanted help. And then in January 2018, my chief exec took me into his office and suspended me for my conduct over the previous months. And that was the last day that I ever worked for anyone. Because what I realized that day was that I no longer had the coping mechanism that I'd had since a 5-year-old boy. I no longer had school, and I no longer had that employment to turn up for every single day. And the first phone call I made was not to my wife or anyone like that, it was to the Samaritans, because I knew that I wanted to end my life. I went to my GP a couple of days later, and they gave me antidepressants and diagnosed me with depression and anxiety. That was the least of my concerns. But they referred me to the Glasgow Psychological Trauma Centre, but told me it would be 4 or 5 months before I could get an appointment. And those 4 or 5 months became the darkest 4 or 5 months of my life. I had no support from my employer and ultimately left my employment. But by the end of April 2018, I decided to end my life. And I made plans to do so for early May. However, through a very serendipitous and universal intervention, that never happened. The day that it was planned for never happened. And by the end of May, my life had turned around. I'd got my appointment for the Glasgow Psychological Trauma Centre, and over 2 days of assessment, and from the first time me being brutally honest about everything that I'd been through, they diagnosed me with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was the happiest man alive to be diagnosed with a mental illness. I used all of my high functioning skills whilst I had PTSD to actually overcome complex post-traumatic stress disorder and learn about it and turn all the positive attributes to it into setting up my own business. And it's been the best thing that's ever happened to me. Having a mental health breakdown has been the best thing and worst thing that's ever happened to me. The worst thing because for a period of time it's very difficult to get through, but the best thing because I no longer have that fear of judgment, of that fear of the stigma that would go with admitting to have a mental illness, of that career suicide should I ever want to tell a boss that I've got mental illness. Now I have none of those things. And as a result of all of those experiences, I decided to set up Let's, in the hope that through my experience in the corporate world, in the business world, and local government world, as well as my own mental ill health, I could help organisations start the process of trying to change the culture within workplaces. And the reality of all of that is that it starts with you. It starts with you, the watcher or the listener. You're the person that can change the culture of mental health in the workplace. You can make a difference. Now, I asked at the very beginning for you to think about what would you have done if you had been my colleague, manager, director, chief executive back then. But the second part of the question is really the part that you have to think about. What will you do going forward from now? Because the world has changed from pre-lockdown to post-lockdown. And the one thing I can guarantee everyone watching this just now is that there's someone like me in your organisation just now. Might not have the severe extent of trauma that I've been through, but there's someone like me who's in your workforce who's sitting thinking, I can't talk to anyone about my mental health. I can't open up. I wish there was something that I could go to, someone, someplace, somehow. Have a think about that. And let me ask you, what resources do you have? What policies and procedures do you have in place that would accommodate your staff? But let me ask you, would you go and see a counsellor for 6 weeks? Or whatever your employee assistance scheme says. If it's not good enough for you, why is it good enough for your staff? Ask yourself that question. But fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to end on is that you can be the change. You have an amazing opportunity going forward after today to be the change within your organisation that you would like to see, but also staff who may struggle with their mental health in the organisation would like to see as well. So ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to be here today. Again, I would like to thank Latham, I'd like to thank the PPNA for inviting me here today. And ladies and gentlemen, take the opportunity and be the change. Thank you very much.